They asked her to leave without an explanation, but Karoline wasn't about to let that slide. Here's what happened next. Karoline Leavitt sat at her usual corner booth at the Oak Room, the local bistro she had frequented for years. It wasn't just any restaurant, it was her sanctuary, the place she could always count on for comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of place where the waiters knew your name, where the manager stopped by to ask how you were doing. She loved it here. The day started like any other, had just finished a meeting, and this was the perfect spot to unwind. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mixing with the sounds of clinking glasses and quiet conversations. Karoline had a table by the window, the one with the best view of the streets. He could always spot the changes in the neighborhood. From here, the construction projects, the new businesses opening, the occasional parade down Main Street. As she scanned the menu, her mind still racing from the mornings of events, she noticed a new face among the staffer. Tall, middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face and a sharp suit. She'd never seen him before, but it didn't seem unusual. New hires were common enough. When the waiter came over, Karoline ordered her usual grilled salmon with a side of roasted vegetables. He smiled, already anticipating the meal, but before the waiter could leave, the new man walked over to the table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. Karoline looked up, confused. "Yes, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the man said, his tone blunt. Karoline's browford. "Pardon me?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Thinking she had misheard him. "You need to leave now," he said again, more insistent. This time the man didn't seem angry, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. He was standing just a little too close, his body language stiff. It was as if he was waiting for her to argue, to cause a scene, but Karoline wasn't the type. She looked around the restaurant, seeing the other diners steal glances in her direction. No one was saying anything, but they were watching. She felt a brief flash of confusion, but it was quickly replaced by a calm clarity. Karoline had been in uncomfortable situations before, but something about this felt off. She didn't know what was happening, but it didn't sit right with her. "Can you tell me why?" she asked, her voice steady, polite, though her heart rate had definitely picked up. The man paused, and for a moment it seemed like he might back off. Instead, he stood there, hands clasped in front of him, his eyes cold. "I don't need to explain," replied. Currently, Karoline could feel her pulse quickening, but she didn't let her emotions show. She had seen enough to know that sometimes people had power trips, that some folks thought they could just push others around for no reason. She wasn't about to let that happen today. Not here, not to her. "Actually, I think you do," Karoline said, her voice still calm, but now carrying a note of authority. "I've been coming here for years, and I've never been treated like this. If you're going to ask me to leave, I deserve an explanation, just like any other customer would." There was a pause. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked over his shoulder at the manager, who was standing near the kitchen door watching them closely. The manager made no move to intervene. That was strange. Karoline had always seen the manager around, chatting with customers, making sure everyone was comfortable. Why wasn't he stepping in now? She could feel her frustration building, but she held it back. She wasn't about to escalate things unnecessarily, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the principle of the situation. The man looked back at her, as though deciding what to say next. Finally, he spoke. "You're disturbing the other customers," he said. Those words lack conviction. Karoline raised an eyebrow, surprised by the weak excuse. "Disturbing," she repeated, glancing around the room. Everyone seemed to be minding their own business, chatting quietly or sipping their drinks. There was no commotion, no uproar. "This is a public place," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm just here for a meal. I'm not disturbing anyone." But the more she spoke, the more she realized that the situation wasn't as simple as it appeared. There was something else
going on here. She had to know what it was. What had happened? Why was she suddenly being asked to leave without any explanations? She looked the man in the eye. "I'll leave, but only when I understand why you're asking me to go. I think that's only fair. The manager
had yet to move, still standing in the doorway, staring at them both. Karoline could feel his gaze burning into her. But she didn't flinch. She wasn't going anywhere until she had the answer she needed. This wasn't just about her. It was about respect, and she wasn't going to let this man walk all over her without a fight. But would she get the explanation she was looking for? Was this going to be a fight she never saw coming? Karoline stood her ground, the quiet murmur of the restaurant around her providing an oddly soothing backdrop to the escalating tension. She had never been the type to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. The man in front of her wasn't giving her any real reason for his actions, and the manager still hadn't intervened. It was as if he was waiting for something. Or perhaps he was hoping she would just leave without making a scene. The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. This wasn't about the meal. It was about being treated with respect. She had been a loyal customer for years, and here she was being asked to leave for no reason. She wasn't going to deal. Let this slide. The man's posture remained rigid, as though he was still preparing for her to argue. His eyes flickered between her and the manager, who hadn't moved from his spot by the kitchen door. Karoline noticed the slight tension in the air, the way everyone in the restaurant seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She couldn't help but wonder, what was really going on here? Why was she being singled out like this? It didn't make sense, and the longer the silence stretched, the more she realized that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had made a decision about her that she didn't even know about. "You haven't given me a reason," Karoline said again, her voice unwavering. Man's jaw clenched. He looked over at the manager once more, who had finally started to walk toward them. There was a flash of something annoyance across the manager's face, but he said nothing as he approached. "I'm sorry, Mum," the manager finally said, his tone uncomfortably neutral. "We've had a complaint about you." Karoline blinked, taken aback. "Complaint about me?" Her mind raced. She couldn't remember doing anything that would warrant a complaint. She'd always been polite, never causing a scene. "What kind of complaint?" The manager hesitated. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information," he said, his voice stiff. Karoline felt a surge of disbelief. "You're telling me that you're going to ask me to leave over something I don't even know about?" The man standing next to her didn't say anything, but his posture stiffened further. It was clear that the situation was becoming uncomfortable for him too, but Karoline didn't care about making him uncomfortable. She cared about getting the truth. "I don't think this is right," Karoline said firmly, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't just talking to the manager anymore. She was speaking to everyone around her. "I've been coming here for years. I've never caused any problems. If someone has an issue with me, I deserve to know what it is." The manager's eyes flickered, and Karoline could see the hint of a struggle on his face. For a brief moment, it seemed like he was considering backing down, but instead suicide they house. Then he cleared his throat and stuck to his position. "I'm sorry, but I've been instructed to ask you to leave." "Jim," he said, his tone losing its earlier edge, now sounding more apologetic. Karoline took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. She could feel her pulse rising, but she refused to let her emotions take control. She wasn't just gonna walk out without understanding why this was happening. She turned her gaze back to the man beside her, her voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving until I get an explanation. I've been a loyal customer here, and I won't be treated this way without knowing why." For a moment it looked like the man might argue, but instead he just shook his head slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The manager too seemed to be caught between wanting to handle this quickly and realizing that Karoline wasn't going to back down. "Listen," Karoline said, her tone softening just a little. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to understand what's going on. If there's a legitimate reason for me to leave, I'll go. But I deserve to know what it is." The manager looked at her, then back at the man. There was a moment of hesitation before he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Mom," he repeated. "It's just protocol." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Protocol? She echoed the word hanging in the air. What protocol? I've been coming here for years. This place has always been welcoming. What's changed? The man and the manager exchanged an unreadable look. It was as if they were both waiting for something. Maybe for Karoline to break. Maybe for her to leave without asking more questions. But she wasn't about to do that, not now. The silence stretched, and for a moment, Karoline thought she might be getting nowhere. But then something shifted, but as the tension continued to build, Karoline could sense that this situation wasn't about to end quietly. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Karoline felt like the eyes of every single person in the restaurant were fixed on her. The tension hung thick in the air. She could sense the manager and the man beside her both growing more uneasy by the second, but she wasn't about to back down. She needed answers, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. "I'm still waiting for an explanation," Karoline said, her voice even but firm. She wasn't going to let the situation slide, just because it was awkward or uncomfortable. "Why am I being asked to leave? What complaint could possibly justify this?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, as though he was trying to decide whether he should continue with this bizarre charade or finally come clean. Karoline could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him for a brief second. She saw the manager's face soften, perhaps just for a fleeting moment, but he quickly masked it with an impersonal expression. "I don't have all the details," the manager said, his voice growing quieter. "I was just told to handle it. But I assure you, we don't normally ask people to leave for no reason." Karoline took a deep breath. The manager's words felt hollow, and she could sense he was struggling with the situation. He had to know something wasn't right, and yet he was still clinging to the directive he'd been given. "Can you at least tell me who made this decision?" She pressed her eyes, narrowing slightly. "Who gave the order?" The manager hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the man standing by her side. "It came from the owner," he finally muttered, as though it pained him to admit it. "But like I said, I don't know the full reason." Karoline's heart raced. The owner. That was a name she hadn't heard in a long time. The Oak Room had been her go-to spot for years, and she knew the owner, a woman named Joan. Joan had always been kind, attentive, and understanding. Karoline had never once felt unwelcome there. She stared at the manager. "Joan, the owner. That doesn't make sense. I've known her for years. Why would she ask me to leave without any explanation?" The manager glanced back at the man, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. Karoline didn't let up, though. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to shift in her mind, and something isn't adding up. This wasn't just a random complaint or some routine misunderstanding. There was more at play here, something deeper. But what the man standing beside her, who had been eerily silent up until this point, finally spoke up. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice low and slightly apologetic, though his words were still firm. "It was just a misunderstanding." Karoline tilted her head. "A misunderstanding? Then why didn't anyone clarify it before things got this far?" She gestured around the room. "I've been sitting here for over an hour, and no one said anything." To me, the man shifted his weight, his eyes darting between her and the manager. It was clear now that he was uncomfortable, but Karoline wasn't about to let that stop her from getting to the truth. Something was fishy, and she was determined to figure out what. "Look," she said, her voice steady and sharp. "I've been loyal to this place. I've always treated people with respect, and I expect the same in return. If there's a misunderstanding, fine, but I deserve an explanation. Not to be treated like this." There was another long pause. The tension was suffocating. The man seemed to be trying to muster some kind of response, but he wasn't sure how to proceed. He looked back at the manager again, who had yet to make eye contact with Karoline. But it wasn't until the manager spoke again that the first cracks in the mystery began to appear. The manager finally exhaled deeply. If he had been holding his breath all this time, Karoline could see the weight of the situation pressing on him. But it wasn't just the pressure of the moment. It was guilt. He knew that something wasn't right, and he was finally starting to break under the tension. "I'm really sorry for how this has gone," the manager said, his voice wavering. But the owner, she had some concerns about you. Karoline's heart skipped. A beat concerned for her. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she had no idea what the manager was talking about. Concerns? What kind of concerns? Karoline asked, her tone firm, yet controlled. You're telling me I've been coming here 4 years, and suddenly, the owner has concerns about me. What happened? I need to know. The manager hesitated, his eyes darting to the man standing beside Karoline. The man seemed uncomfortable, but said nothing. Karoline could see that he was still trying to figure out how to navigate this delicate situation, but Karoline wasn't going to let him off that easily. Not anymore. I'm just the manager. I don't know all the details, he muttered, shifting from one foot to the other. But I think it's something to do with the way you've been the way you've been engaging with other customers. Lately, Karoline raised an eyebrow. Engaging with other customers. She repeated, her voice edged with disbelief. What exactly are you implying? The man beside her suddenly stepped in. His voice low but urgent. Look, it's not about you, okay? It's just, there was a misunderstanding about some of your interactions with other guests. He swallowed hard before continuing, as if he was carefully choosing his words. The owner thought you were making others uncomfortable. Karoline blinked, completely taken aback. This was the first she'd heard of anything like this, and it made no sense. She had always been friendly, polite, and respectful to the other patrons, sure. She was outgoing and social, but never in a way that would make anyone feel uncomfortable. This whole situation felt like a twisted game, and Karoline wasn't going to let them play her, making people uncomfortable. Karoline repeated, her voice rising slightly, with confusion and frustration. How, in what way? I've been here for years, and I've never had a complaint about my behavior. If someone felt uncomfortable, they should have said something, but I've never, not once, been told that I was doing anything wrong. Manager glanced nervously at the man again, but this time the man remained silent. Karoline could see that the walls around them were starting to crumble. She wasn't just questioning the situation anymore. She was calling them out for their inconsistency. The manager looked down, avoiding Karoline's gaze. Look, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't want to be in the middle of this. I'm just doing my job, but if you want to talk to Joan, maybe you should just give her a call. Karoline felt a surge of triumph, but she kept it contained. She wasn't going to settle for an apology in a simple phone call. Now, this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure this kind of treatment didn't happen again. Fine, she said, her tone sharp and decisive. I'll call Joan. But before I leave, I need to hear the truth. No more vague excuses, no more dodging the question. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his words trapped somewhere between regret and frustration. Karoline could tell that he was finally seeing how much he'd messed up as the silence stretched on. Karoline stood tall, her confidence unwavering. She'd taken control of the situation. It wasn't just about defending herself, it was about making sure that her voice was heard. But what would Joan say when Karoline finally made that call? Would the owner admit to her mistake, or would this situation spiral even further? Karoline took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table. She could feel the weight of the moment. But she wasn't going to let it overwhelm her. She had fought for the truth, and now it was time to hold the people responsible accountable. The manager had already begun to show signs of remorse, but that wasn't enough. Karoline wasn't here for half-hearted apologies. She wanted to hear from Joan herself. Give me a moment, Karoline said to the manager, her voice steady. She wasn't asking for permission, but she was giving them the space to react. She pulled out her phone and dialed Joan's number, her fingers moving. With practiced precision, the phone rang twice before Joan answered, her voice warm and familiar. Karoline, it's been a while. How are you? Karoline took a second to compose herself before responding. I'm fine, Joan, but I need to talk to you about something. Urgent. I'm here at the Oak Room and I've just been asked to leave by your manager with no explanation whatsoever. And to make matters worse, I'm being told that I've somehow made other customers uncomfortable. I need to know why this is happening. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Karoline could almost hear the gears turning in Joan's mind as she processed the situation. Joan had always been someone who took pride in making sure her restaurant was a place of comfort and respect. This didn't sound like the kind of issue that would have escalated this far without something going wrong. "Karoline, I'm so sorry," Joan said after a pause. "I had no idea any of this was happening. I trust my staff, but if there's been a misunderstanding, we need to sort it out." What exactly happened? Karoline's frustration melted slightly at Joan's genuine tone, but she stayed focused. "I've been a loyal customer here for years. Joan, I've never had an issue with anyone. Not once if someone had a problem with me they should have serving up, but no one did. I'm being told there was a complaint about my behavior, but no one has told me what I supposedly did wrong. I'm here trying to enjoy my lunch, and now I'm being asked to leave." Joan let out a frustrated sigh. "I am so sorry for this. I've known you for years. Karoline, you've always been respectful and polite. If there's been any confusion, it should have been handled differently. I'll have a word with the manager immediately. This isn't how we run things." Karoline could feel her heart slow as the weight of the conversation began to settle. She wasn't just getting an apology. She was getting accountability. Joan wasn't making excuses or trying to brush the situation under the rug. "I appreciate that, Joan," Karoline said, her voice softening. "But this isn't just about me, it's about making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen to anyone else. I don't want to cause trouble, but I can't just let this slide." "I understand, Karoline," Joan replied. "I'll fix this right away. You deserve respect, and I'll make sure the staff knows that moving forward, I want you to feel comfortable when you come here." The conversation ended with Joan promising to handle the situation. Karoline hung up the phone and turned her attention back to the manager, who was standing there awkwardly avoiding her gaze. The man beside her had disappeared somewhere into the background, likely retreating to avoid any further confrontation. The manager cleared his throat. "I've spoken to Joan. She's very upset about what happened, and she's promised to make things right." Karoline nodded, satisfied with Joan's response, but not quite ready to let the manager off the hook. "Just yet. I appreciate you talking to her, but this whole thing could have been avoided if you had just communicated properly. I was a paying customer just trying to enjoy a meal. I shouldn't have been treated like this." The manager looked down, his face reddening. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I should have handled it differently. I'm really sorry for the way this went down." Karoline's expressions often apology accepted, but remember, it's not just about making apologies, it's about treating people with respect from the start. "No one should feel like this." The manager nodded earnestly. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Karoline gave him a small smile. "I'm glad to hear it. Just make sure the next time something like this happens, communication is key." As she turned to leave, she could feel the eyes of the other customers on her again. But this time it was different. This time she had taken control of the situation. She had stood up for herself and shown that there was power in calm communication, even in the face of confusion and frustration. But as Karoline walked out of the restaurant, she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was a reminder that respect and clarity were not just privileges but rights, and sometimes all it took was one person standing firm to bring about change. As Karoline stepped out of the oak room and into the cool afternoon air, she took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. The conflict was over, but it lingered in her mind. It wasn't just about the unpleasant exchange or the awkwardness of being asked to leave. It was about the principles behind it all. She had walked into that restaurant expecting nothing more than a pleasant meal, but instead, she'd been thrust into a situation that tested her patience, her ability to stand up for herself, and her belief in fairness. But now that it was over, Karoline felt a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't let her emotions take control. She had stayed calm and composed, handled the situation with grace. And in the end, she had gotten the apology and clarity she deserved. More importantly, she had made sure the problem was addressed in a way that would ensure no one else would go through the same thing. As she walked down the street, heading back to her car, Her thoughts began to shift from the events that had just unfolded to what she had learned from it. He knew that this wasn't just a story about a woman being asked to leave a restaurant. It was about the power of self-respect, the importance of communication, and how standing up for what's right can lead to positive changes. He thought about how easily she could have walked out of the Oak Room, and frustration avoiding any further confrontation. She could have simply accepted the vague explanation, left without saying a word, and chalked it up to a bad experience. But instead she'd asked questions, demanded answers, and insisted on being treated with respect, and by doing so she had not only resolved the conflict, but also ensured that the manager and the owner knew exactly where she stood. But Karoline wasn't just proud of her ability to handle the situation, she was proud of how she had used her voice to make a difference, not just for herself, but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. This wasn't just about a meal or a restaurant, it was about taking a stand for fairness, dignity and respect in all aspects of life. As she got into her car, Karoline smiled to herself, thinking about the lesson she had learned in the process. She had reminded herself and the people around her that standing up for yourself doesn't always require confrontation. It doesn't require raising your voice or creating chaos. Sometimes it's about being calm, being confident in knowing your worth. Her mind drifted to the other customers who had witnessed the exchange. She wondered if they would see things differently now. She wondered if they would be more inclined to speak up, if they found themselves in a similar situation. Karoline had always believed in the power of example, and in this case, she hoped her actions would serve as a reminder that standing up for what's right could lead to positive change, even in the smallest of moments. As she pulled out of the parking lot and drove down the street, Karoline couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had handled herself with grace, and she had made sure her voice was heard. And in the end, that was all anyone could really ask for. But as she thought about it, Karoline realized that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do in difficult situations is to simply remain calm, stand our ground, and always demand the respect we deserve. This was the lesson that she would carry with her, moving forward, no matter where life took her next.